Here's the introduction for your YouTube video story. The night was quiet, too quiet. A soft wind rustled through the trees, leaves whispering secrets in the dark. The old house stood alone at the edge of the woods, its worn-out porch creaking under the weight of time. To most it looked abandoned, just another forgotten place on a road no one traveled. But inside, a man lived, one who had seen more battles than he cared to remember. A veteran, toughened by years of service, now choosing solitude over the noise of the world. What he didn't know was that, on this very night, two intruders were about to make a grave mistake. The men had been watching the house for days. They saw an old man, living alone, no family visiting, no signs of security cameras. Easy target. That's what they thought. Just a simple break-in, grab whatever they could find, and get out before anyone even noticed. Cash, jewelry, maybe even some old war memorabilia they could sell. It was supposed to be quick. Simple, but they had no idea what or who was waiting for them inside. Dressed in dark hoodies, their faces hidden beneath shadows, the two men moved through the overgrown yard, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. The broken-down car sitting in the driveway reassured them. Whoever lived here didn't seem well off, but that didn't matter. Sometimes the best treasures were hidden in the most unexpected places. The taller man, Jake, signaled to his partner, Luke, who nodded and carefully tested the doorknob. Locked. Of course, but locks could be picked. As they worked on the door, the air around them felt strange, almost too still. A faint sound, barely noticeable, came from the back of the house. A soft rustling. Maybe just the wind. Maybe not. But they were too focused on breaking in to notice the pair of eyes watching them from the shadows. Inside, the veteran was deep in sleep. He had lived through war, experienced dangers beyond imagination, but he slept soundly, knowing he was never truly alone. His protectors, his most loyal companions, were always there. They didn't need alarms or locks to do their job. They had instincts sharper than any humans, senses trained for the battlefield. And now their training was about to be put to the test once again. The door clicked open. The men exchanged glances, their excitement barely contained. They had done this before. In and out. No one would even know they were here. They stepped inside, their boots pressing lightly against the old wooden floor. The air smelled of dust and something else, a scent they couldn't quite place. It was musky, strong, and unsettling. Luke reached for a flashlight, but before he could switch it on, a low growl vibrated through the darkness. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to freeze them in place. Jake grabbed his arm, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Luke nodded slowly. His hand trembled slightly as he clicked on the light. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the room. Empty. Just an old living room with worn-out furniture and framed pictures of a younger man in uniform. Then another sound. This time, closer. A soft but heavy breathing. A presence. Watching, waiting. The flashlight flickered as Luke swept it toward the hallway. And that's when they saw them. Two large shadows, low to the ground, bodies tense and still. Eyes locked onto theirs, glowing faintly in the dim light. The men barely had time to react before a deep, guttural snarl filled the air, sending a chill down their spines. These weren't just any dogs. These were military-trained canines, built for battle, trained to detect threats, and eliminate them without hesitation. And right now, Jake and Luke were the threats. Their so-called easy job had just turned into their worst nightmare. Would they make it out? Or had they just stepped into a fight they couldn't win? This introduction builds suspense, keeps the audience hooked, and naturally integrates elements of tension and action. It leaves the story on a cliffhanger, making viewers eager to see what happens next. Let me know if you need any tweaks." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. The moment felt stretched, seconds crawling like hours as he stared at the two hulking figures in the dim light. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. "Dogs," Luke whispered, barely able to get the word out. But these weren't ordinary dogs. Their stance was different, too disciplined, too calculated. They weren't barking wildly like regular house pets. No frantic movement, just stillness. Watching, studying. Jake had seen dogs like this before in videos of military operations, guarding soldiers, trained for combat. His stomach twisted. They were in trouble. Luke shifted his weight, his hands clenched into fists. "Maybe they're just guard dogs," he muttered under his breath. "We back up slow, get out before." The growl came again, deeper this time, vibrating through the floor beneath them. The air felt heavy, charged with something dangerous. One of the dogs took a step forward, muscles rippling under its dark coat. The other stayed put, eyes locked on them like it was waiting for something. Jake swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his feet wouldn't budge. He had broken into houses before, dealt with alarms, nosy neighbors, even a police scare once. But this was different. These dogs weren't reacting like normal house pets. There was no hesitation in their stance. No fear. Luke took a slow step backward. The floor creaked under his weight, and in an instant, everything changed. The dog closest to them lunged forward, not wildly, but with precision. A controlled movement, powerful and deliberate. Luke stumbled back, his body slamming against the wall as he fumbled for something, anything, to protect himself. Jake barely had time to react before the second dog moved, cutting off their escape route. Panic hit like a tidal wave. This was supposed to be easy. A quick job. But now they were trapped, with two trained canines blocking their only way out. Jake forced himself to think. "We need to get to the door," he hissed, his voice shaking. Luke's breathing was ragged. "How? They're in the way." The flashlight in his hand flickered as his grip tightened around it. He aimed the beam at the dogs, but it did nothing. They didn't flinch, didn't retreat. They were waiting, for what? He didn't know. But something told him that if they made the wrong move, it would be over fast. Somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard creaked. The sound sent a chill down Jake's spine. The veteran. They had been so focused on the dogs, they'd forgotten about the one person they were here to rob. An old man, living alone. At least, that's what they had assumed. But if these dogs belonged to him, then maybe he wasn't as helpless as they thought. Luke must have realized it too. His eyes darted toward the hallway, the darkness stretching beyond where their flashlight reached. "You think he's..." Jake shook his head sharply. He didn't want to think about it. Didn't want to consider what kind of man owned animals like this. Another step, another growl. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew they had only seconds to decide. Fight or flee. But how? These dogs weren't moving like they wanted to scare them off. They were moving like they were waiting for permission. And that terrified him more than anything. Luke's fingers twitched, his instinct telling him to make a move. But before he could do anything, the silence was broken by a voice. Calm, steady, controlled. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." It came from the hallway, deep and weathered, carrying the weight of experience. Jake's stomach dropped. The old man was awake. A shadow shifted in the darkness, and then slowly a figure stepped into the faint light. He wasn't what they had expected. Not frail, not weak. The veteran stood tall, his gaze sharp, taking them in like he had seen 100 men just like them before. He didn't look scared. If anything, he looked like he had been waiting. Luke took a shaky breath, his back still pressed against the wall. "Look, man, we did." The veteran held up a hand, and instantly the dogs stiffened. Their growls silenced. Their ears twitched, waiting for his command. Jake felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just some old man living alone. This was someone trained for war. Someone who had seen real danger. And someone who didn't need a gun to defend his home, because his dogs were weapons all on their own. The silence stretched. The air thickened. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, the veteran spoke again. "You have exactly 5 seconds to explain why you're in my house." Jake's throat went dry. His mind screamed at him to come up with something, anything, that would get them out of this. But before he could open his mouth, the veteran did something that made his blood run cold. He snapped his fingers, and just like that, the dogs moved. Luke barely had time to react. The moment the veteran's fingers snapped, the dogs surged forward, not in a frenzy, not recklessly, but with terrifying precision. Jake stumbled back, his hands flying up instinctively, but it didn't matter. In a blink, one of the canines was inches from him, its breath hot, its muscles coiled, a low growl rattling through its chest like a warning. The other dog had Luke cornered, its massive frame blocking any chance of escape. Jake's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He had dealt with bad situations before, but nothing like this. His eyes darted to the veteran, hoping, praying that the old man was bluffing. But one look at his face told him otherwise. There was no hesitation there. No mercy. Luke's voice cracked as he tried to keep still. "Look, man, we didn't mean anything by it. We just..." "Just what?" The veteran interrupted, his voice even, his eyes locked onto them like a predator watching prey. "Thought you'd take what didn't belong to you. Figured an old man was an easy target." Jake swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to lie, to spin some story, but what could he possibly say that would make this situation better? Nothing. He had never felt this outmatched in his life. Luke shifted slightly, but the dog in front of him let out a sharp, guttural warning, freezing him in place. Jake saw it in his friend's eyes, pure fear. This wasn't just about getting caught. It was about survival now. The veteran took a slow step forward, his boots scuffing against the old wooden floor. The air was thick with something Jake couldn't quite place, something colder than fear. A presence. The feeling of being in the hands of someone who had been through worse than this. Someone who had no reason to be afraid of two desperate men. "I've seen men like you before," the veteran said, almost conversationally. "Always looking for an easy way. Always thinking no one's watching." His gaze darkened. But someone is always watching. Jake didn't know what to say. The silence pressed in, stretching unbearably long, until Luke finally broke. "Look, okay," he said, his voice cracking under pressure. "We didn't think anyone was home. We thought the place was empty. That's all. We weren't looking to hurt anyone." The veteran raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "And that makes it better." Luke flinched. "No, we made a mistake. All right. We'll leave. Right now. No trouble." The veteran exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing at his sides like he was weighing his options. "No trouble," he repeated, almost like he was testing the words. Then his gaze flicked toward the dogs. "You think you walk in, take what you want, and walk right out. That simple." Jake braced himself. He didn't know what the veteran was planning, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. The dogs were still, their bodies tense, their eyes flicking between the two intruders. They weren't acting on their own instincts anymore. They were waiting for a single command. Jake could feel his palms sweating. His legs were aching from standing so still, but he didn't dare move. not until he knew what was coming next. The veteran studied them for a moment longer before finally speaking. "You want to leave?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Luke nodded frantically. "Yes, yes, man. We just want to go." The veteran tilted his head slightly, considering. Then he did something that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. He smiled. Not a kind smile, not a forgiving one. A smile that held something else, something unsettling. "All right," the veteran said. "You can leave." For the briefest second, Jake almost believed him. He almost let himself feel relief. But then, the veteran snapped his fingers again, and the dogs moved. Jake barely had time to process what was happening. The dogs lunged, but not in a frenzied attack. Their movements were precise, controlled, like they knew exactly how to push fear to its breaking point. One of them rushed toward Luke, stopping just inches from his leg, its growl sending a shudder up his spine. The other dog circled around Jake, cutting off any thought of escape. Jake's breath came in sharp gasps. His body screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The veteran stood just a few feet away, arms crossed, watching. There was no gun in his hands, no raised fists, but somehow he was more terrifying than if he had been armed. Luke's voice cracked as he stammered, "You said we could leave." The veteran tilted his head slightly, like he was considering the words. Then he spoke, slow and deliberate. "I did." His eyes flicked to the dogs. "But I never said it would be easy." Jake clenched his fists. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had done jobs before, quick in, quick out. No one was ever supposed to get in their way. But this a nightmare. Luke, always the reckless one, took a step back. The dog in front of him tensed, its ears twitching, ready to react to the slightest wrong move. "Look, man," Luke tried again, his voice thin with desperation. "We get it. Okay. You win. Just call off the dogs." The veteran's expression didn't change. "You think this is about winning?" His voice was calm, but there was something colder beneath it. "You came into my home. You made that choice, and now you deal with the consequences." Jake's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about scaring them off. The veteran wasn't letting them walk away without feeling what it meant to pick the wrong house. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, for the first time since the chaos started, the veteran moved. He took a slow step forward, and the dogs responded instantly, their muscles shifting, their eyes locked onto Jake and Luke, like a predator sizing up its prey. Jake fought to keep his breathing steady. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You want us to beg. Is that it?" The veteran let out a quiet breath. "I don't want anything from you." His gaze sharpened. "But maybe it's time you learn what it's like to feel powerless." Luke twitched. Jake could see the panic rising in his friend's eyes, the way his mind was racing for a way out. But there was no way out. Not yet. The dogs took another step forward, close enough that Jake could see the faint gleam of their teeth in the dim light, close enough that he could feel their breath on his skin. And then, the veteran lifted his hand. Everything stopped. The dogs froze in place, their bodies stiff, waiting for whatever signal would come next. Jake didn't dare move. He didn't dare breathe. Luke swallowed hard. "Please," he whispered. We're sorry." For the first time, something flickered in the veteran's expression. Not softness, not sympathy, but something deeper. A quiet understanding. Then, without breaking eye contact, he said 2 words. "Start running." Jake's stomach dropped. And then, the veteran dropped his hand. Jake didn't think. He didn't hesitate. The moment the veteran's hand dropped, his instincts took over. He turned on his heel and bolted, his legs barely able to keep up with the pure terror surging through his body. Luke was right beside him, his breath ragged, feet kicking up dirt as they sprinted toward the woods. The only sound behind them was the crunch of leaves, the pounding of their own steps, until it wasn't. A sharp guttural bark cut through the air, then another. The dogs were moving. Fast. Jake didn't dare look back. He could hear them, the unmistakable rhythm of paws against the ground, closing the distance too quickly. Faster. Luke choked out. But there was no faster. The house was behind them, the trees ahead, but the space in between felt like an endless stretch of ground that they'd never be able to clear in time. Jake's lungs burned. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew, deep down, that they weren't going to make it. The veteran wasn't just letting them run. He was hunting them. Just when he thought the dogs would reach them, a voice rang out, sharp, commanding. Down. The bark stopped instantly. The heavy footfalls of the dogs skidded to a halt. Jake stumbled, his momentum nearly sending him sprawling face-first into the dirt. His whole body shook with adrenaline as he finally turned to look. The dogs stood just feet away, perfectly still, eyes locked onto them, waiting. But they weren't the only ones. The veteran had followed them. Jake's breath hitched. How had he moved so fast? He was just standing on the porch moments ago. But now he was there, emerging from the darkness like a shadow, his stance unshaken, his eyes unreadable. You run like men who have never been chased before, the veteran said, his voice calm. Jake had no idea what to say. His entire body was trembling, his mind struggling to catch up. The fear, the confusion, it was all blurring together into something he couldn't control. Luke, still panting, managed to croak out, "We're done, okay. You proved your point." The veteran took another step forward. Did I? Jake could feel the weight of his stare, pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what was happening anymore. The game had shifted. The script had flipped. They weren't just running from a robbery gone wrong. They were caught in something much bigger, something they didn't understand. Then the veteran spoke again, his voice lower this time. You weren't the first. The words sent a chill through Jake's spine. The veteran glanced toward the house, his expression unreadable. And you won't be the last. Something about the way he said it made Jake's stomach twist. This wasn't just about a couple of burglars picking the wrong house. There was something else going on here. Something deeper. Luke swallowed hard. What? What do you mean? The veteran didn't answer right away. He simply turned and whistled. The dogs immediately trotted back to his side, obedient as ever. Then he looked back at them and said, You want to leave. Walk. But if you run again. His eyes darkened. They won't stop next time. Jake believed him. Every part of him believed him. But there was one problem. Something told him they weren't supposed to leave. Not yet. Not without knowing the truth. And for the first time that night, a new kind of fear settled over him. Maybe they had walked into something far worse than they ever could have imagined. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to take the chance they had been given and disappear into the night. But something about the veteran's words lingered in his mind. Asterisk, you weren't the first, and you won't be the last asterisk. He exchanged a look with Luke, whose face was pale under the dim glow of the moon. He could see the same uncertainty there, the same unspoken question hanging between them. What did the veteran mean? What had they really stumbled into? Jake took a slow step forward, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. Who else came here? His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The veteran studied him for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose, as if he had been expecting this. Without a word, he turned and began walking back toward the house. The dogs followed closely at his heels, their eyes still flickering back toward Jake and Luke, like they were waiting for an excuse to chase them down again. Jake hesitated only for a second before following. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew he couldn't leave without answers. Luke gritted his teeth but stuck close behind. The air grew heavier as they neared the house, a strange, unsettling energy pressing down on them. The veteran pushed open the door and stepped inside without looking back. Jake swallowed hard and followed, his breath shallow as he entered the dimly lit space. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. It wasn't the mess they expected from a man who lived alone with 2 military-trained dogs. Everything was in its place, clean and organized, as if time inside these walls moved differently. The veteran walked to a wooden cabinet against the far wall. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a key, and unlocked it with a quiet asterisk click asterisk. Then he stepped aside. Jake felt a lump form in his throat as he peered inside. Stacks of old, yellowed newspaper clippings were neatly arranged on the shelves, along with several small boxes, each labeled with a date. His hand shook as he reached for one of the newspapers and pulled it closer. The headline made his stomach drop. Asterisk asterisk, KWO, men go missing after attempted burglary. No Tracy found asterisk asterisk. His eyes darted down the article. It was from 5 years ago. The details were eerily familiar. 2 burglars, a quiet house on the outskirts of town, no signs of a struggle, just gone. Jake turned to look at the veteran, his throat dry. What happened to them? The veteran's gaze was steady. They made a choice, he said simply, just like you did. Luke let out a nervous laugh, but there was no humor in it. Okay, man, you're messing with us, right? Just trying to scare us. His voice wavered slightly. The veteran didn't answer. Instead, he reached for one of the small boxes on the shelf, flipped open the lid, and turned it toward them. Inside, 2 wallets sat neatly stacked. Jake recognized the faded leather of one immediately. He had seen it earlier that night. On the floor of the shed. His blood turned to ice. He stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't just some old story. It wasn't a warning. It was a pattern. A cycle. And now they were part of it. The veteran's voice was quiet when he spoke again. I gave you an out, he said, his eyes darker than before. But you had to know, didn't you? Jake couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The dogs shifted at the veteran's feet, sensing the tension, their bodies coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. And then, the lights flickered. A deep, low growl rumbled from behind them. Not from the dogs. From somewhere else in the house, Jake's stomach dropped. The veteran didn't move, didn't react. He just smiled and whispered, "You really should have run." Jake's breath hitched in his throat. The room seemed to shake around him, the walls pressing in, the weight of everything crashing down at once. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He was frozen in place, trapped in the gravity of the veteran's words. Luke was trembling beside him, his eyes darting between the veteran, the growling darkness behind them, and the door, the only exit. He looked like he wanted to run, but neither of them knew if they still had that option. The veteran stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. The only movement came from the dogs at his feet, their ears twitching, muscles tensed, waiting. But they weren't the ones growling anymore. Jake turned his head slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The noise was coming from somewhere deeper inside the house. A shadow shifted in the dim light, too large to be the wind, too deliberate to be a trick of his imagination. Then silence. The growl stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving behind a suffocating stillness. Jake felt the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. The veteran exhaled softly. "You want answers?" His voice was almost gentle, like he was speaking to children who had wandered too far from home. Some questions aren't meant to be asked. Jake clenched his fists, forcing himself to push through the fear clouding his mind. "What happened to them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The veteran tilted his head slightly. "The ones before you." Jake nodded. The veteran's eyes darkened. "They ran." Luke swallowed hard. "And?" The veteran took a step closer. His gaze locked onto them like he was measuring something unseen. Then he said, "They didn't make it." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He wanted to believe it was another mind game, another way to scare them. But something about the way the veteran spoke made it impossible to ignore the truth laced between his words. Luke let out a shaky breath, rubbing his face with both hands. "Okay," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Okay, fine, we get it. We shouldn't have come here. We messed up. But we don't have to end up like them, right?" He looked at the veteran, desperate for some kind of reassurance. The veteran held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "No," he said simply. "You don't." Jake's chest tightened. "What do we have to do?" The veteran glanced at the open cabinet, at the old clippings, at the names and faces that had come before them. Then he sighed. "You walk out of here," he said, voice steady. "You never come back. You never speak of this place again. And you live." Jake didn't hesitate. "Deal." Luke was already inching toward the door, nodding frantically. Yeah, absolutely. We never saw anything. We were never here." The veteran studied them both for a long moment, then nodded once. He turned, walked to the door, and pulled it open. The night air rushed in, cool and crisp, the outside world just beyond the threshold. Jake didn't wait for another invitation. He grabbed Luke's arm and moved, forcing his legs to carry him toward the open door, past the veteran, past the dogs, past whatever lurked deeper inside that house. He stepped onto the porch, his breath shaky, his skin clammy. Luke stumbled after him, eyes darting back nervously, as if expecting something to change at the last second. But nothing did. The veteran simply stood there, watching, silent. The dog sat at his feet, still and patient. The house behind him loomed, dark and unmoving, as if it had already swallowed its share of secrets and was content to let these two escape. Jake hesitated only once, just long enough to look back over his shoulder. The veteran was still watching. Jake swallowed. "Why?" he asked. The veteran's brow lifted slightly. "Why let us go?" For the first time, the veteran's lips curved into something that almost resembled a smile. It wasn't warm, wasn't kind, but it wasn't cruel either. "You were smart enough to ask," he said. Jake didn't know what that meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to. He turned back toward the trees. Without another word, he and Luke started walking. They didn't look back again. They didn't stop. They just kept moving, step after step, away from the house, away from the unanswered questions, away from whatever had nearly claimed them. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, the house had disappeared behind the trees, swallowed by the night. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They had come looking for easy money, a quick score. Instead, they had found something else. Something they would never speak of again. And they would never forget.